That is lesson number 6 in the divided kingdom. And by way of quick review, we're covering a period of time from the end of the united kingdom of Israel until the fall of the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Now, the united kingdom existed under the rule of King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. And all 3 kings ruled over all 12 tribes of Israel. But due to Solomon's great sins, God took the greater portion of the kingdom from Solomon's son and divided the kingdom. 10 tribes broke off from David's dynasty and formed the kingdom of Israel, and 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, remained loyal to David's bloodline and formed the kingdom of Judah. Now, last week we gave an overview of Elijah and Elisha's ministry in the kingdom of Israel. We saw that there are many similarities between Elijah and John the Baptist in the New Testament, and there are some interesting connections between Elisha and Jesus as well. Now, we didn't go into this, but we did note that John the Baptist is connected with Elijah by the people of Israel, and that Jesus performed several miracles that are very similar to Elisha's miracles. And if we get a chance, we'll come back and study this some more. I'm interested in it personally. I don't know, I didn't ever make that connection. I've always made the John the Baptist Elijah connection, but the Jesus Elisha connection I didn't think about until I read a little footnote, and then I was like, wait a minute. And it got my mind to going on this, so that's why I shared it with y'all. But I want to go back and do more study and see what we can come up with. Now, today what we want to do is pick up with 2 Kings 11 and try to go through chapter 17. This section of Scripture does not begin on a high note or even a hopeful note. Instead, it focuses upon Athaliah, the mother of the slain king of Judah, Ahaziah. All right? Now, Athaliah is the queen, and she rules, it's an unknown amount of time, but it's about probably 7 years is the best we can guess. All right? And she reigns for anywhere from 2 to 7 years. And she's indicted for 2 major sins. The first, the execution, after the execution of her own son by Jehu, she attempts to wipe out the house of David. All right, so she wants to wipe out, I'll just use that, that's not a good technical term, but it's a good country term, wipe out David's line. All right, that's the first thing she wants to do. And the second thing, and by the way, on this wiping out David's line, she almost succeeded, but Jehosheba, the daughter of Athaliah, hid Jehoash, that's Athaliah's grandson. Jehosheba hid Jehoash, and the priest in particular hid him in the temple for several years. Second, Athaliah's next great sin was she was a Baal worshiper. All right, so these Israelites just never could get away from Baal. And it's a terrible thing because God kept showing his superiority over Baal. Elijah had already wiped out 400 of the prophets. Elijah had already called down fire. Elijah had already worked great miracles and said, hey, if your God's so great, let him match my God. And they couldn't do it. They knew that Elijah was a man of God, and yet they would go back to Baal worship every chance they got. Now, in the northern kingdom of Israel, Baal worship was introduced by Jezebel, who was an outsider. But here in Judah, it's introduced by an insider, and it's close to the temple of God. It would be like us right across there at the community center, setting up a false idol and saying, let's worship it. I mean, right across the street from the church, let's put up a Baal center and worship it. It would be wicked for the people of the city to do that, but how much more wicked would it be for this church to do that? So it was an insider. But this is not totally unexpected because she is said to be the granddaughter of Omri, who was a wicked king, and the daughter of Jezebel. So Athaliah is from the line of Omri and Jezebel. Now don't worry about these family trees. They get very jumbled up very, very quickly. But I only want to point out the interesting connections where they're needed. Now there's something else interesting here. There are no prophets to confront the Baal worship of Athaliah as Elijah did in the north. Remember, Athaliah is in Judah. She's in the south. All right? So the south is the only kingdom that had good kings. They had 4 of them. Israel in the north had no good kings. So you would think, with the temple in Jerusalem being in Judah, that God would send more prophets there than he would anywhere else. But in the story of Athaliah, we don't have a prophet showing up. All right? Why not? Because the system is not broken in the south, in Judah. The priest, led by Jehoiada, and the people lead an anti-paganism revolt. Jehoiada is a priest, and he leads the priest, and the people join in, and they all lead an anti-pagan revolt. Okay? Now, it's also interesting to note that Jehoash, who was hidden by the priest for 6 years, when he becomes king, he devotes much of his time and efforts into repairing the temple. Sounds like a good thing. He's raised by the priest. He's in the temple. He comes out and he cares for the temple. He wants to repair it. But after 23 years of reigning, even though money has come in for the repairs, not a single repair has been made on the temple. Instead, somebody, one of the priests, has been misappropriating the money. And this suggests that though the priests were right in running out the Baal worship, at least some of them were corrupt when it came to God's money. Okay? In other words, we don't want any competing religions, but I'll take money under the table. Now, this is self-serving for their interest. If other people are worshiping other gods, that competes with their religious system and takes away their importance. So they may not have been attacking the Baal worship with a pure heart. They may have been doing it for their own interest. But we can say something like that because when they had the chance to take the money and repair the temple, they took the money and put it in their pockets. Okay? Now, Jehoash commands, therefore, that all the money coming in from that point forward goes to the temple repair. The only exception is that set forth by Leviticus, which takes care of the priest. So that sounds like a good thing. All right, I'm going to set aside some money. We're going to repair the temple. No temple repairs are made because the priests are misappropriating the funds. So he says every penny except for the priest's money itself is now going to go into the temple, not some set aside, but every penny of it. But for all of his positive contributions, Jehoash had great failures as well. First of all, he did not eliminate the high places. And that's a problem for the kings of Israel every time a new king comes into power. They have to deal with those high places. Now here's the catch. Who was building the high places? Who was responsible for them? The people. The people were building the high places. And so Jehoash doesn't go in and destroy the high places. Instead, he lets the people continue to have these false worship centers. Second of all, he took God's sacred vessels from the temple and he bought off King Hazael when Hazael invaded Jerusalem. In other words, instead of standing tall and standing firm and trusting God to defend Judah, he says, I'm going to take the vessels out of the temple, the gold and silver vessels, and I'm going to give them to Hazael, and maybe he'll go away. So he took what was holy and gave it to what was profane. Thirdly, and this is the big one, after the death of Jehoiada, the priest, Jehoash turns away from God completely. The man who was raised by a priest, the man who helped lead an anti-pagan revolt, This man turned away from God when Jehoiada died. And when Jehoiada died and Jehoash turned away from God, then the prophets show up. But what did Jehoash do with those prophets? He ignored them completely. He ignored them completely. See, as long as Jehoiada was in the priesthood, remember what I told you. Why do the prophets show up? It's a bad thing, and what has gone wrong? The people, but there's a particular group of people. What? The priests. Yes, as long as the priests are doing their jobs, the prophets rarely show up. It's when the priest system breaks down that prophets come in from the outside. Remember, the prophets are outside the priest system. They're kind of like white blood cells. When the priesthood gets infected with a germ, paganism, then the white blood cell comes in to protect the body, and it attacks the germ, which is oftentimes in the priesthood when they show up. So Jehoiada was a healthy priest. He led a healthy team of priests because of his presence and influence. But as soon as he died, Jehoash's true colors came through, and there was no longer that restraining influence of the priesthood. And so Jehoash turns his back on God, begins to openly be a pagan king, and the prophets then show up to correct him. But he ignores them completely. And this led to devastation at the hand of the Syrians. Now that's chapters 11 and 12. In chapter 13, in the north in Israel, Jehu, and these names overlap. There's Jehus in the north and the south. You'll get them all confused. Just remember the next king of Israel is followed by his son Jehoahaz and his grandson Joash. Now Jehoahaz, and these names get hard to say because they add a lot of syllables to them. Jehoahaz is the puppet of Syria. His army consists, Jehoahaz's, the king of Israel, his army consists of only 50 cavalry, 10 chariots, and 10,000 infantrymen. That's it. He's got less than 11,000 soldiers in his army, but only 50 cavalry and 10 chariots. He wasn't going to win any battles by himself. Now, it's interesting here that Elisha is still around, but he never shows up in the ministry of Jehoahaz in the text. Joash, the next king, however, does meet with Elisha. And Elisha commands the king to shoot arrows as a sign of God's victory over Syria, and then to strike the ground with the arrows as a sign of how many times Joash would defeat Syria. In other words, what he does is he says, shoot an arrow, and that represents God's victory over Syria. Then take the arrow and strike the ground for the number of times that God is going to defeat Syria. Now, how many times, Jesse, would you have beaten the ground? Till you got tired, right? I mean, you would have been... But what happens is Joash only hits the ground 3 times. That's it. He had the chance for overwhelming, complete... God had already said, every how many times you hit the ground, that's how many victories you'll have. I'm like Jesse. I would have been hitting it until my arm fell off. But he did it 3 times. And that's all the victories that he won. God was willing to give him complete victory, and he was satisfied with 3 victories. Now, in the end of chapter 13, Elisha's powerful presence is felt once again. Look at 2 Kings. Look at 2 Kings chapter 13. This is a good story, and it's only 2 verses. So, 2 Kings 13. Verse 20. 2 Kings 13, verse 20. All right, 13:20. And Elisha died, and they buried him. And the bands of the Moabites invaded the land at the coming in of the year. And it came to pass, as they were burying a man, that behold, they spied a band of men, and they cast the man into the sepulchre of Elisha And when the man was let down and touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood up on his feet. That's one of the most amazing stories. 2 verses. It's a great story. It's a great story. All right? Now, so Elisha dies. He's buried in the grave. We don't know how long he's been there, but it's his bones that are left by the time the man touches them. And the man is there in a hurry, so they say, hey, here's a cave. They throw him in the cave, and it hits Elisha's bones. And when it does, the man gets up and walks out. Now, 2 things. If I had been there, I'm going to leave there in a trail of dust. I know he was dead. I witnessed it. I carried him out of the city, and now he just got up. I ain't sticking around to find out about this. But the second thing is, when I did finally stop and realize everything was okay, I'm going to praise God, because I'm going to say his prophet who represents God was so holy to God that God allowed him to work a miracle after he was dead. After he was dead. Now that tells you it's not Elisha's power. It's the God of Elisha's power. And that's pretty amazing. In chapter 14, Amaziah follows Joash as the next king of Judah. So we're back in the south again. All right, and Amaziah is successful in war against the Edomites, and this encourages him to go to war with the superior kingdom of Israel. It's now Jew versus Jew. So it's Judah versus Judah. Judah versus Israel. That's Jew against Jew, brother against brother. And in such cases, little David, does not always win. By the way, I don't know how this is going to turn out, but Michelle and I and Valley are watching The House of David on Amazon. So far, it puts up a disclaimer at the front of the movie. It says, we've taken every caution to be as accurate to the biblical text as possible. However, we have taken some liberties for the sake of storytelling. But so far, we've only watched 2 episodes, but so far, it has been very true to the Bible. And it's pretty good. And it's pretty neat to see Goliath walk out, and it's just like the Bible says. They don't make him a couple of inches taller than everybody else. The men on horses, the king, when Goliath walks by, they're looking up at him. He's, 11, 12 foot tall, and he's massive. And David runs at him with his sling, and it's pretty impressive to see. They bring it to life. But anyway, the little David does not always win. Sometimes Goliath does, and that was the case of Judah versus Israel. Joash, the king of Israel, defeats Judah and plunders the temple and the royal treasury of Judah. Now, in the last 7 verses of chapter 14, we find an interesting character, King Jeroboam II, king of Israel. All right, so we're back in the north. And you remember Jeroboam, right? Up in the north. Jeroboam, bad king. He's the one that was the first king of Israel. And he was evil. All right? And now we got somebody that wants to be Jeroboam II. That's like saying, I want to be Hitler II. Yeah. Can you imagine if somebody raised up there and said, I want to be Hitler Jr.? That's what he was doing. All right? So, his reign lasts 41 years. And his reign saw the ministries of Jonah, Hosea, and Amos. And all 3 of these men prophesied during Jeroboam II's reign. Then we come to, and so if we had time, we could run over to those prophets and see the condition of Jeroboam's kingdom. But we all know the story of Jonah. We all know I hope we know the story of Amos and Hosea, at least in rough form. Things were not good in Israel. Things were not good in Israel. In chapter 15, the first 7 verses cover the 52-year reign of Uzziah in Judah. He's the contemporary of Jeroboam II in Israel. So back down in the south, this is in the north. And at the same time, you have Uzziah in the south. All right, and both of these kings ruled a really long time, 41 and 52 years respectively. All right, now, Isaiah received his commission as a prophet in the year of Uzziah's death. And this is the interesting thing about Uzziah. He was struck with leprosy due to his grievous sin of offering inside the temple. He offered an offering inside the temple and then officiated there. Does that remind anybody of any other king? It wasn't in the temple, but what king offered sacrifices? Solomon did okay because it was Saul. Yeah, so it's so easy to get those names confused. Saul went in and said, I'm tired of waiting on Samuel. I'm going to offer the offering. And God said, the kingdom has been taken from you. Now Uzziah goes into the temple and says, I'm going to offer the offering and I'm going to officiate as a priest. But only the priests were allowed to offer the sacrifices and officiate in the temple. I don't understand. I really don't grasp this. You're king. Why not be satisfied? The prophet, priest, and king roles are completely distinct from one another, except for one man, Jesus Christ. When a king wanted to be priest, he was taking on the role of Jesus. He was taking on the role of Jesus. And there's only room for one Son of God to be prophet, priest, and king. So that's why it's such a great sin. And he was immediately struck with leprosy and driven out of the royal palace. Now he's followed by his son Jotham, who's a good king in many ways, but guess what he does? He fails to remove the high places. Now chapter 16 describes the 16-year reign of Jotham's son Ahaz, or Ahaz, if we pronounce it more properly. He receives the strongest condemnation of all the Judean kings and most of the Israelite kings. That includes the Jeroboams now. You got to think about this. Ahaz is on bad terms when he's described more severely than the Israelite kings. He worships in the high places. Who's the last king in the Bible to worship in the high places? Think about it. We talked about it. Before Ahaz, who's the last king mentioned that actually worships in the high places? Solomon. Remember his pagan wives led him and he went up into the high places and worshiped the pagan gods? Now Ahaz comes in and he worships in the high places. 1 Kings chapter 3 verse 3, by the way, is where Solomon did this. Not only did he worship in the high places, but Ahaz also made his son pass through the fire. And what is that a reference to? And do you remember which god it was? Yeah, Moloch. It's Moloch, okay? So he is worshiping Moloch, and he's worshiping in the high places, and that's pretty bad. But his greatest failure by way of time spent on the sin is Kings' description of his appeal to Assyria for assistance against Syria and Israel, who have teamed up against Judah. All right, so Ahaz goes to, he's got Israel and Syria. Israel and Syria against him. All right, so Israel and Syria are coming against him. So what does he do? He goes to Assyria, that's Nineveh, bad guys, and he says, let's partner up and beat Israel and Syria. Assyria, Syria, all these names get confusing, I know that. All right? But he's a fool. He's a fool. He sees a short-term solution, and he's blind to long-term consequences. I want what I want now. I don't care what it costs me later. All right? And by the way, he eventually becomes a vassal state of Assyria. Assyria looks down there at him and says, hey, we'll keep Israel out. We'll keep Syria out. But you can't protect yourself from me. I'm the bully on the block. So guess what? You're now my nerd. You are now the one who's going to do what I say when I say to do it. You're going to give me your money, your taxes, and you're going to pay me, or else I'll come take over you as well. Okay? So chapter 17 describes the end of the northern kingdom of Israel. So this is where Israel comes to an end. And chapter 17 describes the end of the northern kingdom in 4 distinct units. Verses 1 through 6, verses 7 through 23, verses 24 through 33, and verses 34 through 41. Now in verses 1 through 6, the reign of Hoshea, the last king of Israel, and the fall of Israel at the hands of the Assyrian king are described. All right? So the northern kingdom falls in 6 verses. 6 verses. They're gone. 200 years of history, 6 verses, they come to an end. Verses 7 through 23 gives a theological explanation of the fall of Israel. And why did Israel fall? Yeah, they sinned against God, they were idolatrous, they rebelled, they abandoned the line of David, and the list goes on and on and on. We could probably sit here and name 20 sins that they committed. But in the end, they sinned against God, Jesse. You're exactly right. And God said, enough is enough. And so Israel came to an end. In verses 24 through 33, the non-Israelites who were when Assyria would take over a nation, they would take the population of the bulk of the population of that nation, and scatter it throughout the rest of their provinces. All right? So here, what happens is, when they took over Israel, they took people from other provinces and brought them in. Why do they do that? Common sense. Why would they take the population and scatter it through the other provinces? That's right. Exactly. They separate them, they divide them, and then their rebellion is over. Okay? So the non-Israelites that were put into Israel began worshiping Israel's God along with their own gods. But in verses 34 through 41, the Israelites turn their back on their own God and they become addicted to idolatry. It's bad enough to take God and put him in with other gods. That's what the foreigners did. But it's even worse to reject your God completely and just worship the false gods. They didn't even think enough of their own God to include him in their pantheon. That's how bad it was. Now, what's interesting to note here is that condemnation is not heaped upon the evil kings of Israel, but the people of Israel. The exile, therefore, is not because of the sin of a few, but because of the sin of the masses. Why does it talk about the kings then and not the people of Israel in these chapters? Because God gives a nation what? The leaders they deserve. We find that over in Isaiah. Isaiah said, my people have turned my back on me, and now women and children are going to be their leaders. They're going to have false princes. And he goes on and gives because they turned their back on me, they're going to lose the right kind of leader. And so that's one thing that gives me hope when I look around this nation and around the world and I see more conservative leaders coming into power in certain places. It lets me hope. What's that country with the line they just let you walk across? Hungary. It's a Christian nation, you know, and they're trying to hold out. There's other nations that are trying to become more true to Bible values. That gives me hope that not the whole world was going to hell in a handbasket. So a second interesting thing here is that Israel's sin is, and I'm quoting, it's against, first of all, the Lord their God who brought them out of the land of Egypt. It's against the Lord their God who brought them out of the land of Egypt. In other words, before they sin against the law, they sin against the God who saved them. Israel's rebellion then, and think about this, Israel's rebellion is a rebellion against grace before it is disobedience to law. Now that'll preach. If I wanted to make a sermon off that, I could make a sermon off of that. Because the first thing that people have to do in order to go to hell is reject the grace of God. Then they go about breaking the laws. Breaking the laws don't put you in hell. Rejecting Jesus puts you in hell. But once you reject Jesus, you're going to continue to break the law of God every chance you get, ultimately. You see, Israel's rebellion then was a rebellion against God's grace before it was a rebellion against God's law. A third thing of interest here is the numerous sins with which the author indicts Israel. He just gives sin after sin after sin after sin. He just keeps heaping it up. And this answers an important question that is unspoken in the text, but which all of us are asking. Why was Israel exiled? Why was Israel destroyed? Is God unjust? Is God unfair? The text proves that to be wrong. No, God is merciful and gracious beyond compare. But there is a judgment that eventually comes for sin. Now, we can certainly see a pattern in the stories up to this point. God raises up a king, the king sins, the king is judged. But behind the scenes, the writer is indicting the people for their great sin as well. They've sold themselves to false gods. They've sold themselves to false hope in pagan nations. They've cast God aside. And in the end, they pay the ultimate price of death and exile. So what can we learn from the story up to this point? God is not a God to be trifled with. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that shall he also reap. And here's the terrible thing about that verse, the terrifying thing, the scary thing, the thing that really catches my attention. How do you plant a stalk of corn? What do you put in the ground? A seed. How big is it? Very small. And what does that one seed produce? Big plant with multiple stalks of corn, multiple seeds on that stalk. Not only do you reap what you sow, you always reap more than you sow. The Bible says sow the wind and reap the whirlwind. It's a terrifying principle when you don't live a godly life. It's a terrifying principle. Be not deceived, God is not mocked. God is merciful, but Michelle says this, taught me this little saying, don't mistake my kindness for what, Shell? Yep. Don't mistake my kindness for weakness. Don't mistake God's mercy for weakness. That's a terrible, terrible mistake to make. God is not only kind and merciful, He's also righteous. And we have to remember this, or we'll face the severe consequences in our own lives. The Bible is primarily written to the saint. And I believe that this story of Israel's demise coincides well with the book of Romans. In Romans, we find instructions on how to avoid God's wrath in this lifetime. For who? For Christians. How to avoid God's wrath in this lifetime. Now, why is this so important? Because there are great and severe consequences for sinning against the Creator God of the universe. There's great and severe consequences. I'll go back to this Sunday morning Sunday school lesson when I asked one of the people in the Sunday school class, have you ever sinned? And they said, I have. And I said, give me an example of just a little sin. And they said, I stole an orange. That makes them a lawbreaker. That makes them a thief. And when you sin against God, there are consequences for doing it, even stealing an orange as a child. You know it's wrong, and you do it anyway. There's consequences. How do I know that? The wages of sin is death. You mean stealing that orange earned me death? According to the Bible, you became a lawbreaker. You earned wages, and those wages are death. Now, what's the answer to this problem? Well, if you're a Christian, your sins have been wiped away, but you still are going to be judged for how you live the Christian life. As a matter of fact, are you held to a higher standard or a lower standard than before you were saved? Christians are held to a higher standard. A higher standard. Because they're now sons of God. So they're held to a higher standard. So let's resolve as Christians to live a godly life. Let's resolve to put God first in our lives. Let's resolve to read His Word. Let's resolve to pray and talk with Him. And let's resolve to lead our families in this way. Why? Because if we do, we don't have to fear God's judgment. We can enjoy God's blessings. But if not, the warning is clear. Even the chosen nation of God was brought into severe punishment. And what does the Bible say about a Christian who continues to sin? We have instances of one-time sins causing a problem with Ananias and Sapphira. They came in, they said, hey, we're giving all the money that from our land to the church. And Peter said, why have you lied to the Holy Spirit? And what happened to them? Right there on the spot, they dropped dead. But it doesn't always work that way, and people think I'm getting away with it, I'm getting away with it, I'm getting away with it. But what does the Bible say? If you see a brother sinning a sin that's unto death, I do not say that you should pray for it. A Christian can sin until the point of death. That's physical death. That's death in this lifetime. If we don't remember who we serve and we don't remember His standards, then the warning is clear. But if we do, God will bless us, and He'll bless us to do His will in all that we do as an individual, as families, and as a church. I'm very proud. It's one of the most proud moments of my life this morning when we prayed over the two men that had cancer. I'm so proud to be a part of this church. That was one of the most powerful and meaningful things I've ever witnessed in a church. And two people were led to the Lord this morning. Now, you may not see a connection, but I think there's a strong connection. A church that prayed and said, let God's name be lifted up. God allowed that same church to lead two young people to the Lord. Connect the dots. They were watching. They were watching. You can't put God first without there being consequences. And you can't put God last without there being consequences. He's either one or the other. He's either first or last. We put Him first this morning, and God bless this church. Let's put Him first every day, all day, and see what God will do for us as individuals, for our families, and for this church. Thank you all for coming.